Hello and welcome to the Best Practices Summit. Pollinator Friendly Alliance is a grassroots 501c3 nonprofit that protects the natural world through the conservation of pollinators. Our co-host is the Xerces Society, a science-based nonprofit.
Hi, everybody. My name is Steve Tomforde, and I'm going to give a talk about grazing ecology and biodiversity and restoration and how they all fit together with pollinator habitat conservation and all food webs. And I just really want to, I've been to every single one of these conferences, and I just want to reach out and thank everybody, Lori, and everybody that we've worked with since the beginning, and just watching this really grow and become such a phenomenal event. I like this event a lot because they allow people to think outside of the box more and bring in a lot of just really collective knowledge and regional knowledge. And so it's really a nice group of a great place to come and present. Okay, so I like to start my conversations by, I'm just going to throw this out. I am not here today to tell you what to think, but I just really want to make you think. And so I will bring you frameworks over the next 45 minutes. I'm not going to give you what genus and species is used, but I'm going to give you the general principles that then you can applicate no matter where you end up. So if you end up working in California or Costa Rica or Europe someplace, you can use these general principles to apply around the world. It's going to be different species and so forth. But it's really important to know the smaller parts, because the more the smaller parts you know and how they fit together, then the greater the general principles become realistic. So it's really good to keep learning as much as you can about all those little parts, because you need to know those parts in order to put them together at this higher level. And that's what I'm going to work on today. There's a peak of grazing right there. Little rabbits, they need to make hay. They need to live on that hay for 6 months in the wintertime. They do not hibernate, so they're haymakers. 70% of the plants that they cut, that they prefer, actually have compounds in them that cures the plant to make the perfect hay. That's symbiotic, a symbiosis, the evolution that wants that grazing animal to harvest that plant. I mean, it's working with that animal. Look at that pollinator habitat behind us. So just an alpine meadow, which is a grassland surrounded by trees. I guess that's a savanna. So these are some of our grassland ecosystems. Okay. Grazing ecology is intense. We can cover all this stuff, but we're not. These are some of the really big principles. I kind of put them in different colors to kind of work where they fit together. But I mean, this is a whole book, and I have to follow the advice from some of my friends, and I need to sit down and write that book. Right away, I'm going to relativize this to herbivory, grazing, herbivory, pollinator conservation. When the first practices were coming out and our agencies were sending around letters, would you like to participate, and give some examples on what you would do to as a best management practice to help pollinators, 2013, 2014. And I remember one of the things I wrote was like, understand pollinators as herbivores. And I knew it was really simple thinking, but it was just a powerful, deep concept that we don't think enough about. And it was, sure enough, I was laughed at and it was crossed off the list and all that. But I'm back here today in 2021, almost 10 years later, and I'm just saying, it's a very powerful concept, understanding that pollinators do, when they are eating flower parts, nectar, pollen, flower parts, they are participating in that ecosystem. Their functional guild is the second trophic level, otherwise known as herbivores. Herbivores are so amazing. Okay. So there they are, Bombus polaris over there. I like Arctic things. And then there's a cottontail bunny. I like bunnies too a lot. They're eating, they're transforming that vegetation into animal tissue. So there's a lot more information, a lot higher quality. So every time you transform that energy, quality of the product increases. Okay. If we just hold it in plants, the ecosystem quality decreases dramatically. So something like that. So as I was thinking about this, one reason I like doing presentations and writing is that you're always thinking. And I just came up with this concept, and I shared it with a couple of friends to make sure it was, at least something to tell as a story. So the difference between these two herbivores is that the pollinators are really working on the information connectivity, whereas your typical grazer, your ungulates, are actually working on structural connectivity, lower, that heterogeneity, low stuff, high stuff, stuff just harvested, and also putting a strong control over nutrient cycling. And so it's that nutrient cycling connectivity too. Some are very hot spots, some are very low oligotrophic areas. So the grazers are moving, and it's not random. Nothing's random in ecosystems. If it is, you better study that. So anyways, one does information, the other one does the structure, but they both need each other. It's just a concept. The DNA molecule flowing across from plant to plant to plant, keeping that genetic diversity alive, which maintains the renewal mechanism, which, maintenance and renewal. And the other one, that's a beaver line. It's just right up where we live. Skiing the other day, we looked down and saw some of these no roads or anything. No roads, no trappers. Look at that. In Potagama, Namakogan Peninsula and Voyageurs National Park, they quit trapping beavers in one area in 1949. And within, by 1990, that area was 20% more wet. And those are sedge meadows to elder swamps and everything in between. All those different successional series of beavers move back and forth about every 3/4 miles. Think of the diversity you get from that. Okay, so it's very interesting, and early successional stuff to late successional stuff. So one's doing the information, polyploid plants, keeping that genetic material flowing. The plants are like, thank you very much, I can persist, that's resilience, that genetic diversity, and the other one's keeping it open for those flowers. So the two of them are working together. They share the same trophic level, and they too have developed symbioses between one another. One regulates the nutrients and the structure, and the other one, the information. The number down there, 59.28%. That's really cool. In the early 70s, when they were doing computers, they wanted to make sure of just what the minimum amount of power, for heat reasons, the minimum amount of power and connectivity in that computer between circuits. What's the number when they ran it? It's 59.28%. That number has a mathematical thermodynamic perspective that we could just put that to the animals and information of that DNA moving across the ecosystem. You break that number and somehow in some metric, then the connectivity is broken. It's kind of a cool concept. I just want to talk about ecosystem function and how the great impacts of grazing on that. And one of our speakers yesterday talked about trophic levels too. And that speaker told me earlier that it's kind of a simple concept, but again, it's a very deep concept, and grazers are a very big impact. So this is the way I'm going to define ecosystem function. I'm going to borrow from the Odoms. They really started working on this stuff. They were so impressed by Raymond Linderman, University of Minnesota, up at Cedar Creek, the first paper of Linderman, his last paper before he dies. But the Odoms were so impressed about it, they actually mentioned it in his first and second editions of their ecosystems, Raymond Linderman, which is really cool. But they're so impressed that they're measuring the function of that ecosystem by the capacity, the amount of solar energy that flows through it, all through food webs. And that's calories over space over time. And the general principle surrounding it is thermodynamics. And like Einstein said, all else will fail, but not the second law of thermodynamics. So it's a powerful concept. It starts small with the plants, the chloroplasts, study that one. I just spent this fall reading about both respiration and photosynthesis again. It's an amazing, and the more I read about it, it's like, wow, we're a completely physical principle, a photon of light wave energy coming in, hits a chemical structure, becomes biological all in a billionth a second, no place else in the universe. And that I'm talking right, where you guys are watching. So the greater the nutrient cycling, the greater the function, the greater the sunlight that's going through there, the matter just follows. And so the greater the energy captured, the matter follows. And if I can recycle it again and recycle it again and recycle it again, I'm really imposing strong regulation of those nutrients. That's where ecosystem services. It's all linked together with this definition. And we can use math, calories or joules per time per space. And we can watch and we can measure that. So it's kind of a cool concept. So how do you increase ecosystem function? Well, one way is we do a lot of it. We do plant restoration. We come in and we see the first trophic level down there, the plants, and we say, wow, look at all the sunlight that's getting through. It's like a sieve, just a few plants that are growing at a certain time in a certain space. So, hey, let's plant it. Now we're capturing more sunlight energy. But now if we can transform that sunlight energy up through food webs, and then like the dung comes out and that starts another food web, and then it goes higher and more dung and more food webs, and then the microbes enter. think of the amount of nutrients that are being there is no nutrients in the abiotic. It's just completely tight. There's no lakes, rivers, and streams that are being toxified by phosphorus and nitrogen. It's all interbiotic. It's important principle. And each time that energy gets transformed from one trophic level to the next, the function under calories per time and space increases 90%. So we can say when we go through a food chain, we transform from one level to the next, we're increasing ecosystem function by 90%. That's really a cool concept. If I don't have the grazers there, the whole thing collapses. All the food chains. And guess what? The nutrients do too. So functional ecosystems are provisional. That's where we get our ecosystem services from. And one day that the ecosystems have evolved to do this over time. I mean, again, that's an autumn ecosystem phenomenology that these organisms evolve to capture and transform that solar energy as a biosphere trying to capture and degrade like an organism energy and get rid of the heat. Okay, that's what we're stopping that with carbon. We're stopping the heat. You know, that's great when I can cool myself. I'm fine warm enough. As soon as I can't cool it, it's lethal. So that's what we're really stopping. So over time, the plants and animals both have evolved to become more edible. So they are eaten, like the pica and the metal harvesting those plants. What do they teach us in botany? And then the plant will develop toxins or thorns to ward off the herbivores. So from one level of analysis, you could say that, but from a higher level of analysis, it's nice to see the big trends. Okay. So what we had here over these long periods of evolution was the most edible vegetation ever to exist on Earth, ever. So there's just, that's Washington, Oregon out there, the Paleos. It's not Minnesota, it's not Wisconsin, it's not Florida, it's grasslands all over the world. So the trees were edible, the understories were edible, the whole rose family, there's whole families that cause that. And so we can see over time that we go from a very much much less edible vegetation and animals. I mean, how many things are eating pine needles, cycad needles, and ginkgo berries? You couldn't pay me to eat a ginkgo berry, and they're not even true berries. It's just a naked seed, actually. It's like a pine cone, but they smell. Anyone that's been around, you know, when a female tree drops those fruits, not fruits, but those cones on the ground, literally just cities disallow planting female ginkgo trees for that reason. They are defending from being eaten, whereas the modern plants are actually wanting to be eaten. So it's a big switch. 20 million years ago in Nebraska, 10,000 years ago right here in the Twin Cities. And then humans came along. We've been managing these landscapes to actually increase herbivory for ever since we've been here, using fire as the primary method that they did that with. I wrote a plan for a natural resource plan, and I realized the Indians had been living, the Native Americans have been living in this area for a long, long time. But the last farm had shut down 67 years prior. And I wrote in the plan that shutting down the farm is not normal, that people didn't live here anymore. They've been living on the land for 9,000 years. And so it was just, you know, 9,000 years. And so it was really just kind of like, wow, maybe we need people living on the land more instead of less. So it's kind of a transformation. So these grassland ecosystems of the Earth really are the most advanced terrestrial ecosystem, whether in the tropics or the tundra. Grasses, sedges, small trees, and grazing caribou and muskoxen. It sounds like a grassland. So kind of an interesting one. So here's something to think too. And again, increasing those trophic levels. Management often, you know, we try to save or protect one thing. And so, you know, but we don't focus on the whole trophic level or the whole food web that organism is from. So maybe we need to focus, you know, on the keystone species that created these habitats for these other species, that often rare species that we're trying to save. Maybe one reason that they're become rare is because of missing those keystone impacts, nutrient regulation, structural regulation. So in order to do that, we probably need all three of those levels at least restored here. Let's take a look at some other invertebrates, because the Pollinator is an invertebrate. The Xerces Society is an amazing group of people doing amazing work, and they're also in partnership with society. But I just wanted to bring some of these up, kind of some interesting stories. The spruce budworm, and one of your speakers yesterday, also Sarah Fultz Jordan, spoke about the grasshopper, and I was like, awesome. I mean, what a pulse of energy that this came through. And they come through in these cycles. All these herbivores came through in cycles, okay? At about 10 to 15, and spruce budworm, by the way, is like 40 to 60 years. So each pulse is different, okay? And they would just take the vegetation down and kind of renew the whole ecosystem by doing that. That's another Odom concept, pulsing. This is a really old pictures from the late 1950s, but I just found this today. I'm like, long range sustainability time. Look at the conservation of information. That's the genetic material and the seed banks that are preserved. If you spread those waves out too far, that information goes away. It rots, it gets burned out, it washes away. And that's the whole concept behind resilience and healing. So here's the budworm. I'll talk about the budworm. This is a good story. So here's the budworm. About every, let's just say 50 years, the population, the birds are eating them, the mice are eating the pupae, and the shrews are eating the pupae. So they're under control. This is the Hauling paper of 1959. They're under control by all these things. But eventually the furs keep coming. And then they get pretty thick. But the budworm comes in about 50 years down the line and starts to take out the whole thing. So that's that big giant pulsing that's going on there. And this then opens up. Of course, we get these oaks coming in. We get white pine are probably released from that. Lots of flowers, asters come. And that's really nice habitat for a variety of creatures, okay? But that's not the desirable state for the pulp industry. They want the fir trees because they love making paper, especially things like the shiny paper. And so they want them. So they're the ones that said, no, spruce budworm is bad. It's a native species. It's an herbivore. And so we just started this. Hauling's writing this in the late 50s. He's taken a ton of flack, okay? Rachel Carson writes her book, what, 64? They're living in the same area. I often think they knew one another and that, they inspired each other to do some of this. So Hauling just gets beat up for writing that, don't spray these guys, just let them do their pulsing thing. Harvest the trees before the spruce bud. Monitor. And when you sense it coming, look for those leading indicators, those early leading indicators, and harvest your trees. Oh, that sounds like a good idea. But they, I doubt Monsanto, I don't know, whoever. But anyways, they really slash him around. And he disappears for 14 years. And then he writes a paper in 1973 called Resilience. He's totally in this whole concept right there. There's some really cool papers by Hauling. I like the 1992 one there. Cross-scale morphology, that is just really geek how animals and plants and insects and everything cannot go between certain weight and volume ratios. It's a mathematical equation he builds, and it's like, okay, fox squirrel, gray squirrel, red squirrel. There's a mathematical formula and it applies to almost all life forms. Isn't it? And probably ecosystems, et cetera, cells, organelles, et cetera. So anyways, and another great paper, there's the 96 paper, Command and Control in the Pathology of Research Management. These are really cool papers. And of course, obviously, Anarchy, very recent. That's resilience. This is concept. I want to get that tattooed on it sometime. And what we try to do is we try to hold those things in climax. The problem with that, that's the optimal sustainable harvest that we get the trees or walleye population, waterfowl population, or deer population. The problem is the longer we hold it there, the more brittle these systems become. And eventually they all want to release, but if we hold them there too long, they're so brittle, they just break apart. In a normal situation, the seed banks are there, the renewal mechanism comes, we go back into fewer trees, we go into more of a grove savanna situation, and then we start the whole thing over again, and here comes the budworm, and here comes some low-level fires. This is happening every 40 years, every 60 years, every 20 years. These are these pulsing cycles that keep that renewal, that maintenance and renewal system in that ecosystem. It changes a little bit each time, okay? But that's the whole concept behind resilience. You have to maintain those processes that maintain maintenance and renewal. So that is really the goal. Here's what we typically do by holding it there: catastrophic fire. And basically we burn up those seed banks, okay? And it can't come back. The Moggy Creek fire here in Minnesota, let's look at some pollinator habitat here. This burned, I think, I can't think, 13 years ago, something like that. I was just looking it up last night. The highest moose density anywhere in the Boundary Waters Canoe area or in Minnesota is 4.6 moose per square mile in the wintertime. And they've come into this situation, which the Forest Service, right off their website, talks about the Powwow Trail after the fire came through, that it looks more like a prairie than it does a forest. Maybe so. Yeah. Here's Pamagi Creek fire 5 years after, or 2 years after that fire came through. Wow. Look at all those flowers in there. And now if the herbivores pulse, if we had our caribou here, if we had our moose here, if we had historic beaver population, if we had the spruce budworm here, they would hold it in this. It would change. It would start getting more treed, more treed, more treed. It would change, but we'd be holding it in that more edible configuration, which is the perfect pollinator habitat with those flowers, those trees. The beavers are coming out and maintaining whole lawns down here. But when we just let it go and we don't have the herbivores, they're taking this down, it goes rapidly back into the tree state. And so that's kind of called disturbance theory, okay? There's a really great quote, 1836, at the end of Trapping the Rocky Mountains. Osborne and Russell, our horses were starving, so we decided to ride up Sweetwater Creek because we knew when we got there, there'd be good pasture. But when we got there, not a blade of grass remained. The buffalo had just come through. Okay, and that's the Grimes hump curve. It basically looks like this on the buffalo with the circle around it. I mean, there's no grazing there, and so it becomes more wooded, a lot less diversity. On the other hand, if we have too many grazers, it becomes a lawn. That's where the word comes from. But if it's just in the middle, that's where we maximize diversity. So when I was an ecologist, no, I mean, seriously, maybe 10 years ago when I was thinking about this, I thought, well, if we just hold it there, it's perfect. We need to find the grazing way to hold it right at that pattern. And that defies the whole concept that Holland's trying to do. We need all of this, and it's going to be changing and not random. It'll change, some areas will be more grassy all the time. Other areas will be more wooded or forested all the time. That's what makes the ecology so maybe a certain percent is held in some place in that middle of that hump. And it should be going back and forth and those affinity circles of hauling. Some places we hold into lawns, these grazing lawns, and other places like northeast facing slope, pretty steep. You can't really walk on that. Good place for a forest, nice and cool. And those are the patterns we probably see. And that's where probably true forests actually persist. Okay? But we too often hold it in that, okay? Let's just look at an impact of an herbivore. This is an amazing story right here. Canvasback ducks were the herbivore of our flyways, both the Mississippi, Pacific, and most likely the Atlantic, for sure. And canvasback ducks, and this story goes with canvasback duck right there, and the plant growing in the background. Now you're looking at about 6, 7, 8 feet of water, crystal clear body water. That's what all of our lakes look like, crystal clear. Nutrients are so scarce in those days that clear water, Vallisneria, that's wild celery or Vallisneria, that's its preferred habitat. Super deep water, crystal clear, warm, eutrophic, meaning that it's growing in rich fertile lands. And it's the underwater version of the oak tree. It leaves all these fruits all over the bottom of the lake. Tubers, just little teeny tubers about the size of peas that are totally edible, totally digestible, have no defense mechanisms at all. And in the following year, that plant blows off the lake in September. And 2 weeks later, the canvasback arrives in millions. Okay. And when the canvasback was shot into functional extinction about 1900, 120 years ago, we killed that. Yeah, I mean, that's amazing to think about. The very first automatic firearm where you just hold the trigger down and shot a machine gun was developed to kill canvasbacks. Powerful, okay? Highly evolved birds, super advanced stuff. The divers are always much more advanced than those puddleucks. And wild celery is the same way. It's an extremely advanced plant. And these two species get together for 10 days every year, just 10 days. And they go nuts. The tubers are 1,000 per square meter, and the ducks are driving. And all these other ducks kind of follow along. It's the movable feast, literally the movable feast. They're bringing up amphipods and scuds. Well, amphipods, same thing. And all these other ducks are just following along. So they were the millions and millions. They're the herbivore, okay? And after 10 days, the energy returns on investment were negative, and they would all take off to the next set. They got one night's flight, 500 miles in that fat. And they would crash into south central Wisconsin at that point, and then Lake Michigan area, and then down in Chesapeake Bay, with a stopover in northern New York and the Finger Lakes. It's the canvasback landscape. The wild celery grew. And that one night, they would remove from those lakes in a very conservative modeling about 7,000 pounds of phosphorus a year in 10 days and 75,000 pounds of nitrogen in 10 days every year. And when they were shot into extinction, those sites became eutrophic in about 10 years, long before modern agriculture had any impact. So it's kind of interesting. That's what that herbivore did. These two species became codependent on each other. They both need the crystal clear water in some way. And that clear water ecosystem then allowed all these species to occur. And notice as we kind of go out in this direction, we move back into the terrestrial. So each one of those terrestrial events, like the meadowlark up there eating, the animal eating the dead fish, I guess an eagle, the otter right there, a lot of them defecate up on the shore. And so that's moving the nutrients back out of that system. Powerful concept. So anyways, and then the canvasback was followed by the scaup and then the buffalo and the ganser. And if you added all those ducks up in about 2 weeks difference, they're just like one leaves, the next one comes. Facilitation theory. And in 1 year, it's like 200,000 pounds of nitrogen. But the diver ducks are basically all gone due to eutrophic water. So the same thing can be said about, our terrestrial herbivores, really regulating those nutrients. This site here is a shortgrass oak ecosystem growing in the metropolitan area. And about 7 years ago, we did remove the last herbivores out of it. And those photographs show beautiful oak savanna from the late 1950s. Hopkins Farm, actually, it's called. 70 years without herbivores. It went from beautiful prairie to, there you go. The nitrogen in that is so hot. There's nothing edible in there to feed a mouse, let alone a pollinator. Okay, that's what herbivore removal has done to this site right here. So it's just kind of interesting, 28 billion pound reservoir. So anyways, I'll just kind of model that, so here it is, we're cycling that nitrogen up through food webs. Just think the dung comes out and then it's eaten by others. So then it really comes under massive control. When we remove the herbivores, obviously the carnivores go away, and then nitrogen just sits and builds up and builds up. And it just attracts these weeds. A lot of these don't provide very many benefits to our native pollinators. They're inedible is another thing a lot, especially once it gets into a deep nitrogen state. And that very grassland savanna then turns into a really nitrophilic, filled with a lot of what we call invasive species. Here is in reality. Oak woods then soon replace oak groves. Soils go bare, we just lose the whole ground layer. Think of the carbon that's washed out of the system. I have places on the hill where you can see several feet of oak roots there. That's how much soil is lost. So in 70 years, how much carbon have we lost? How much sediment into the rivers? I just heard a report yesterday, I was happy to hear it, was that they're starting to determine that a lot of our forested areas are leaking more carbon than they're gaining. Yep. I was glad to hear that it's finally starting to be spoken about. Okay. So we remove the herbivores, the nitrogen builds up, faster, taller growing species replace the shorter, slower growing species. The food webs all collapse, the energy flows collapse, the nutrient cycles are completely collapsed. We lose a keystone process, you go into a chemical imbalance, catastrophic regime shift. So it's kind of just an interesting question you can ask yourself is, are these species really invasive? I mean, there's buffalo in there. Or are they just symptomatic of the loss of wheat and nutrient regulation? So we know the keystone species. Well, oftentimes we think of big, but big also means big in numbers. So maybe it's just total mass instead of individual sizes. That's an amazing herbivore right there. Up to maybe 400 million of these existed in North America. Think what every river and stream looked like, small river, stream looked like. Keystone species. Go to the Chicago Museum of Natural History, and they have an elephant stomach up on the roof, and then an herbivore. And here's the intestinal tract, and there was a pile of dung this deep, and they had then two dung beetles, and they said keystone species of Serengeti. Without these, within 15 years, the whole site would be buried within 10 feet of development. So biotic vortexes, these keystone species, they really operate like that, and that they're sucking up. That is a system, but it's not living because it can't sustain itself. Like I can. We all run down eventually, entropy. But that is just degrading the gradient of cold and hot. Okay. And once that it's mixed up, you go into equilibrium, the tornado and the storm goes away. Okay. I'm doing energy, electrons and protons being pumped across a membrane inside of my mitochondria, making ATP, powers all life on the planet Earth. Everything does that. Eukaryotes, okay. So these organisms, by just consuming all these nutrients and taking up, and all the other organisms that follow along behind them, they can be seen. Although Leopold is a biotic storm or a biotic vortex. That's Leopold stuff. So that's another reason that herbivory allows that to really go. Okay. Wow. Biotic vortexes. It's just something I made up. I kind of like it. It comes from the Leopold storm thing, a biotic storm. I like that concept. Facilitation. Here's a really cool concept too. So this paper comes from Africa. I love this paper. Look at that title, Grazing Lawns, Animals and Herds, Plant Form and Coevolution. He's saying a lot of things right there, that there are whole plant communities that have co-evolved to be grazed at about the same time at the same year for thousands and even millions of years. That's a heavy concept, and it's a really cool paper. This is what it would look like in North America. I've got the grasslands there. I've got some type of fig Gales tree out there. It could be probably a birch, yellow birch, or a white oak of some sort. Here comes the grazer, hot summer day. It's like, man, I want to get some shade. So it goes into the shade, eats some grass while it's there, and mows it down. The next day, the smaller herbivore comes in there and grazes that down. And then finally, here comes the bunny rabbit. And he grazes his, really gets down there and grooms it really nicely. And the next spring, wah, yes, spring finals. That's the grazing. And that's the concept that McNaughton is bringing. And again, as you know, as they migrate, just like our herbivores did, and then they would come there at about the same time each year at about the same intensity, but it would grow in intensity and then it would really shrink and over time too. So all those different cycles, fantastic. Wetlands is another place McNaughton said you would see this, and these would be the same areas that would get mowed down every single year, like again, when they're really thirsty. And so these areas would be like highways for so many organisms to get in and out, ducklings and turtles and amphibians, and everything was using that same channel, where the rest of the shore was surrounded by that. Okay. Buffalo lawns, caribou lawns, beaver lawns, pico lawns. Okay. Very cool concept. My lawn in my house, I've been practicing this for 15 years or so, and I'll get 70, 80 species of plants. But I manage my lawn. I don't know herbicides or anything. I just throw the seed in, and then I regulate the nutrients by pretending I'm a grazer. I could use a mower and collect it in a bag, scissors and collect it and weed around plants that I think are inedible, but it's actually a beautiful wildflower I want to see. I'm feeding bunnies and mice and everything in my lawn. It's a really cool concept. I'm just pretending I'm a grazer. My neighbor said, "You're a low maintenance lawn. You spend a lot more time in your lawn than I spend in my maintenance." And he was right. So these are some of these plants we can call graze obligate, that they need these. In fact, at some level of analysis, all grassland species of plants, vegetation, trees, shrubs, and all, they're all obligate to the grazing purposes. But these are really obligate to the grazing lawn. Pussy tails, kitten tails, and a lot of animals. Literally, so many of these animals were common at one time. And just in the past 30 years, we've lost all the grazers, even in what we consider older grazed pastures. We've lost these species of grazing. It's just fox squirrel is amazing. And turtles, how can this guy go through cattails that tall, or even in big bluestem that hasn't been burned for 5 years? It's just thick. And the birds, look how short the grass is in these things. And just their legs for walking around. And the dung piles, especially for invertebrates, have become massive food webs under their own. Again, regulating those nutrients up into birds and shrews and mice and bigger insects, and and it just keeps going and going. Food webs are amazing. And these are dung specialists. I noticed that a couple of these actually are actually standing near dung piles. These trails for connectivity across the landscape for so many organisms are so important. Ducklings and turtles and what we think, oh, that's bad where they're walking the stream. Look at the surface area that's creating, and where it goes anaerobic on that U shape instead of the flat, the increased surface area, the increased denitrification in the atmosphere. It's like a radiator in your car. And think of the little planktons that like that, and the zooplanktons that may like that, and the larger, like maybe some certain tadpoles. That's their preferred. Yeah, some get stepped on, but in the long run, when we lose that, we lose all that connectivity, that surface area. Specialized little teeny habitats like that. Just stuff to think about, okay? So let's just get back, and we're just gonna go right to the end of it here. And what this can look like if we bring it to the land, basically. And so there's two types of grazing that we do use in conservation. And one is just called suppression. It's like weed management. It's like mowing. It's like haying is an excellent mimic of this stuff, by the way. Different talk. And there's some other people that are doing it too. So it's starting to come on. So we try to release, in this case, it's cattails, and we think if we keep eating it now, especially if we take the nutrients out, if we can actually make it a nutrient export, like it was historically, we can actually then start to increase the diversity in the system. But the way we want to go with this, if we want to maximize biodiversity across all food webs and nutrient regulation, and so therefore ecosystem function and the production of ecosystem service, we need to mimic the historic patterns that are highly super evolved over millions of years. Yeah, the vegetation may have been underneath the soils may have been underneath the glacier here in Minnesota, but down in Kansas, it's been several million years, and that vegetation just moved north. So you have to remember that. Okay? It may have been in a different space, but it's the same vegetation generally going. So that's what we have to make. So that means we need to study those patterns. Like we study fire. What did the Native Americans use fire for? What does the environmental history? And we also have to bring in what was the grazing history. And this, remember, here I'm standing in Minnesota today. The grazers were eliminated from my section of Minnesota in 200 years ago easily, which, yeah, 1700, that's super conservative. I'm going to go, by 1750, they were already trapped out of Hudson Bay. So anyways, it's something to think of. We don't know what this landscape looks like. So can we mimic all these patterns, okay? And that'll be so fun. Think of that. Just think of the research. Hundreds and hundreds of graduate papers, hundreds of professions, new jobs, fencing, moving the animals, et cetera, get tall patches, certain, when you're going to graze to get those grazing lawns, et cetera, okay? Difference between domestic and native. I want native animals everywhere I can, but if we can't have them, technical feasibility, economics, whatever it is, then, the difference between grazed or not grazed is huge. The difference between grazed and non-grazed is phenomenal. It's completely different. The difference between bison and aurochs, or the product of auroch or cattle, insignificant in comparison. Okay, so those are some. In Europe, they're just trying to breed back all their ancient breeds to bring back the auroch, which went extinct in 1620. Again, if we can bring in the up around the Duluth area, they're talking about reintroducing the more of the larger herbivores we have in the land that are native, the better off we're going to be. Okay, but again, we can follow some trends in Europe. This is Europe, okay, and we're getting there. We're getting a lot closer. So yeah, it's some of the and we'll just end it right here. Basically, we'll talk about and how this type of conservation, we can do this across the landscape. We can do so many jobs with doing this way, production of these products and managing the animals and taking care of, restoring the land so it is more edible in a native situation. So there's so much potential in creating these wonderful, wonderful projects that are created on real-time solar energy. And so jobs like in restoration and research and fencing and herding, I want that guy's job actually. So I mean, maybe in a few more years, but yeah, it'd be awesome. Yeah, just making these wonderful products. If that can benefit pollinators and create human jobs and help us with more healthy food all around, and get closer to all kinds of animals, livestock animals and bugs of all sorts. I remember the days as a small kid that the amount of insects we had on our farm, and every farm had cattle, was phenomenal. Okay, and maybe there's some other people now. I mean, you would crack the windows down on your car accidentally on the hottest summer day, and the car would be so full of different, because it was hot, just hundreds and hundreds of insects. So something to think about. I think we can do that. All right, with that, I am done. I really appreciate your time, and I really want to thank you a lot for and Pollinator Friendly Alliance, Xerces Society, for inviting me to speak today. So